So if you guys want to come on up. I got a clicker for you.
Okay.
Get out of your way.
Are we going to do a panel or just do it from here?
Nope. You can do it from the podium or from the chat.
Oh, okay.
Wherever you're more comfortable.
I'll just do it from the podium here. Well, good afternoon. The worst thing you can do to a speaker is after a big lunch is and then do a PowerPoint. So I'm here. So let's get going here. So Scott Holmquist, my background, a little bit about me is that I was in the fire service with CAL FIRE for about 30 years, and then went to work for a large utility within California. So starting this program within that utility of this pole pretreatment, but we'll get going on this presentation here. So the issue is, the metal fragments that when the line conductor, and this is kind of associated with utilities, but there's many causes of vegetation fires out there and the wildland fires that's causing the havoc out there. But the issue with metal fragments or the line conductor that slaps together, a piece of hot metal falls down into the vegetation, causes large damage and loss of life. The hazards are based on historical weather patterns that we've talked about for the last last 12 hours or so. They've been talking about meteorology and all the data gathering and things like that. But the real thing goes down to the fire danger rating system, and that hot metal, or that's in this particular thing with the utilities, is that falling down into receptive fuel bed and causing that ignition. Mechanical thinning within the right-of-ways or around the utility infrastructure, it's very expensive. And a lot of the companies now, based on the latest with the CPUC and their own internal hardening and those kinds of systems, what they're doing is the enhanced vegetation management programs that the companies are doing. Within California and across the West, the fire season are getting, as stated here, 80 days longer over the past 30 years. And we all know that with CAL FIRE even and the Forest Service having year-round fire protection opportunities, that it's very taxing on their employees, let alone their equipment and their resources and that. The average fires are getting bigger, and it is kind of interesting is that actually with the SDG&E folks with the 2003 Cedar Fire that they talked about the other day. And it was a big fire. And it went on for weeks and was very politically fire. And the idea, too, that everybody thought last year the Thomas Fire was going to be, oh my gosh, we'll never beat that record. And then the Mendocino Complex happened this past summer. So fires are getting bigger. 65% of the new home construction are being built in the wildland urban interface areas. So as the population is moving out from those metropolitan areas into the quote-unquote WUI, that's causing lots of different things. And really the ignitions aren't being caused by a lot of that population moving out there. And so there's a lot of land use planning things that have gone on to help that. And with the utilities now, with the, especially the IOUs, the independently operated utilities, with their requirement of submitting, and the other ones of submitting a fire prevention plan, is that a lot of the things in a comprehensive fire prevention plan of the utilities are looking at more systems hardening and not looking at a lot of engineered type of things. They're looking at, metal poles, which the poles aren't causing the fire, but there are those kinds of things. But this results in the significant fires of more property loss and life risk. So a solution, the treatment of a long-term retardant along the right-of-ways and around the utility infrastructure can prevent future ignitions. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but the long-term retardant has been used effectively for many years by the Forest Service and by CAL FIRE and by a lot of the local government agencies, the contract counties. And, but it's been predominantly applied by aircraft in making that happen. So looking at this from a, there's some downsides of that, is that the aircraft can't fly at night. There's a few copters that are flying at night now, but it predominantly doesn't fly at night, and a lot of times on the wildland fires, there's inversions that happen, so the aircraft can't fly. With the ground-applied treatments, they can work 24/7, and they're not affected by the inversions and those type of things. So they continue that retardant operations and pre-treating operations for, you know, firing operations off of a line and or protection to those assets and or pre-treating those assets so they don't get damaged from the fire. Retardant is way more cost effective than mechanical treatment, and it's a lot quicker to do. The new technology that we've been hearing about the last few days with the, again, with the meteorology and that is, can be looked at that and utilize some of that things of, especially now that the map will pop up here later, but within those tier 2 and 3 areas where the probability of those areas are greater, and CAL FIRE and the CPUC was very hand in hand putting that mapping together. I think there's some people here in the audience that might have been involved in that of those areas, but using some of that fuel modeling, some of the weather data that's gathered, and some of the analytics that's done is looking at that potentially for those areas that maybe could be pre-treated to prevent those ignitions. So that more accurate mapping, a combination of real-time monitoring and preventative treatments to reduce the ignitions within the those areas and to reduce the fire spread. So why long-term retardant? So long-term retardant is kind of interesting. This is a kind of a basic fire chemicals class we're going to have here in about 3 seconds. So the long-term retardant is not dependent on water to work. It basically is mixed as a solution with water, and it can work wet or dry. It's actually a chemical reaction. So when the heat hits the retardant, it creates a little bit of a carbon char on the cellulose material, and a byproduct of that is H2O. So it kind of breaks the fire triangle. It's taking the heat out of it, and it's also taking the fuel out of it when that occurs. Thusly, with the Class A foams that folks are used to in here in the fire world, the Class A foams are very dependent on the moisture that's in those foams, and it's a lot like, almost like dish soap. I hate to use that analogy, but it's a lot like dish soap because everybody knows what that is. And it's going to last, like it says in that in the slide there on the Class A foams, it's going to last minutes to hours. And it's going to be dependent on the relative humidity, the ambient temperature, and any wind that's associated with it. The gels are water enhancers. In the Class A foams, it's a water surfactant, so it just breaks the surface tension down and it'll penetrate into that cellulose material a little better. The gels or water enhancers, on the other part, is based on the polymers, and most everybody here is familiar with polymers. It's the same product that are in like diapers. And they're very absorbent, and when they're wet, they work very, very efficient. As the same thing as with the foams, when the moisture is drawn out of that, either from the ambient temperature, heat, or the wind, and the relative humidity, as that goes away, that product's only going to last for a few hours. And a lot of the companies that manufacture that product, they say that it can be rehydrated. But the thing is when you're rehydrating, you're diluting that original concentrate of the product. And number two is, yes, you're basically rehydrating it, but when the moisture's gone out again, the effectiveness is back to, but it's not any good again. The same water would be in that effect. So each chemical has its very unique characteristics, and it behaves differently on those fuels. But the key point is with the retardant is it's going to work wet or dry, and it's the same effectiveness. And the big key thing on that is it's going to last for weeks and months. So you could pre-treat way ahead of an incident, or just in the beginning of a season, if you knew there wasn't going to be any rain, pre-treat, and then be good to go. So how it works, I mentioned this a little bit. We'll talk about a little more. The fuels are treated with long-term retardant. It's actually that chemical reaction. And when fire is exposed to it, the combustions, it's a graphite-like carbon, and then it makes that water vapor. So if you're a chemist in here, you can read the formula and go through the whole thing, but the byproduct of it is it's going to put off that moisture and that carbon char. And it's very, very effective. And the safety things, especially for the utilities that might use it, is that in the past, some of the utilities were going out there and putting foam on the poles or doing nothing, and they're exposing their crews out there. They're not fire people. They're going out ahead of the fire, and they were trying to put the foam on the poles, and they'd have to go out there and retreat. And then when the moisture's gone out, there's no effectiveness. So they're not putting the people out there in proximity, and the retardant, again, hammering this in, it's going to work wet or dry, and it's going to remain until there's about a 1/4 inch of rain. So this is just some examples. This actually is the, on the photo on the left, is from the Mendocino complex this summer, and the poles were pre-treated in the area out there ahead of the fire, and the fire burned there. You can see the results there. The one on the right was on the southern complex of the 2017 fires in Lake Napa unit during October, and the utility crews actually went out there and pre-treated that pole on the right in the morning, and that afternoon when they came back out from pre-treating that day, they're like going, my gosh, the fire burned through here, and that pole's still standing. So it's pretty big deal. So, you know, getting back to the rulemaking for the fire safety from the CPUC, there's all these rules, and some of you folks are very familiar with those, but is the big thing here is that those are the things that's going to focus a lot on the rules and regulation on that. So the vision of this is with the tier 1, 2, and 3 areas in those high fire zones is that if it were pre-treated, you know, it's going to increase the safety of the public in there, and the egress of the personnel that live in there, the citizens that live in there, and for the responders going in. A pole, once it ignites, it's going to burn about 2 or 3 hours before the thing comes down, and the egress is captured, not there. So another thing to think of for the fire people is if there's areas that you know they're going to be the egress for those people come out, that it might be an idea to pre-treat that area so they have that egress, the poles will be in the air and go down. The situational awareness with the weather technology, the meteorology technology and resources, the fire technology, fire behavior, and all those predictions is to put all those pieces together and have a comprehensive fire prevention plan program versus you know, just taking all the situational awareness that's going on and not really actually having any effect on preventative measures of the ignition sources. So long-term retardant is one solution to deal with this programmatically. The possibilities of ignition for the utilities and railroads in identified areas. Some other things that really could be beneficial here is that the, especially for the utilities, is the idea that they could pre-treat ahead of the fire, knowing a fire has occurred and be in reaction, but programmatically pre-treating the right-of-ways, preventing it from the ignition source, hot metal falling down into the vegetation and causing a fire that wouldn't actually ignite. Pre-treating ahead of the right-of-ways and around substations, so if there was a, to keep the fire out of there, or a lot of times in the switch yards or substations, they'll have equipment failures and there'll be hot pieces of material that come out, so it could give it that added area and benefit around there. And another thing for the utility companies is that if they're doing hot work, you could actually pre-treat the day before and not have to get a clearance from the ISO or someone else. You could actually continue to do the hot work and not have to get the clearance and shut off that circuit. So this is just a map of the higher fire threat district maps of the tiers 1, 2, and 3 within California. You can see it's a predominantly pretty much a big section of California. So the value effectiveness is it's the application of long-term retardants, so prevent ignitions. The long-term is also effective in the protection of the wooden poles, the switch yards, the substations, valve lots, whatever you might have, any of your infrastructure from getting it burned up or preventing from going out into the vegetation if it did catch on fire. Reducing or preventing the ignition sources within the right-of-ways that are out there. If the equipment fails, the conductor slaps together, bad line restores, bad switches, and then the previous presenter did this morning of showing the bad connectors and those types of things that fail and the hot piece of metal that come out of that. It's very cost-effective. Is associated with the wooden utility poles, about $20,000, and so the pre-treatment's very cost-effective, under $10 a pole with that stuff. Whoop! I keep going backwards. So again, the benefits of the program is very safe. It's going to prevent and reduce the chance of ignition. It's very the liability of the utilities could be reduced because they're not on the hook for causing the fires or on the hook for the suppression cost, and reduces the disruption to the customers that are out there. And the fail safety of the program, reducing the risk of ignitions and significance of the spread. Just as some other pictures from the Mendocino complex, poles that were pre-treated where the incident came through there. And this is another big thing, is those means of egress were compromised by this utility poles that came down. This is a fire in Shasta County a few years ago where they came by, and so there's no egress. So you talk about the campfire where there was people that were couldn't egress out, that they had to take bulldozers and kind of clear the road with the bulldozers to get people to evacuate. So there's a lot of people that had to jump out of their cars and jump in with somebody else because their tires are on fire. So that, this way, with the keeping the power poles up in there and then not knowing if the power pole was energized or not is the other significant safety thing for the responders and for the community that's at risk there. So with all the technology that we've talked about the last couple of days, with the supercomputing, with the meteorology services, with all those things, it's a good thing for the predictive service and all that stuff, but it's really not preventing the fire. It's a good situational awareness. It's a good idea to where we know where the areas that might need to be pre-treated ahead of time on a programmatic basis, but it still doesn't prevent the fires. So with the long-term retardant, it's a huge benefit to that and reducing those ignitions. So this kind of says it all, just another pole that was pre-treated, and you can see the results there. So, any questions? Yes, sir.
Are you proposing long-term fire retardant as a prophylactic to protect poles like this, or are you also proposing that it would be a substitute for going to bare ground to comply with 4292?
Correct. So you could pre-treat. Yeah, so you could pre-treat, depending on the fuel type and that, if the hot piece of metal or slapped wire or whatever comes down into there so it wouldn't ignite, that's reducing the chance of the fire.
That would satisfy the requirements of 4292 right now?
Well, on the subject poles, it depends if there's an equipment pole or not. No, they're still going to go into the bare soil, but I'm talking about the other storms, the high winds and stuff, the wires slapped together, broken cross arms, those kind of things. The 4292 is going to cover that 8 to 10 foot radius around the pole and those subject poles. Yes. Yeah, no, it's not going to substitute bare ground because this guy will be writing citations over here. So, any other questions? I can. And if you want to, just one last little blurb here. We will be doing a demo. If you want to come see me afterwards, we'll be doing a demo. We can show you on burn strips and how this product works. Okay, thank you.
All right, so we're going back to technology. So while I'm bringing up my presentation, so lightning presentation, right? That sounds to me like it's perhaps not the best choice of words, given what we're talking about. All right, so we're talking about using AI and big data for wildfire protection and fighting. Now, why are we talking about this at all? Of course, we're all witnessing this, and we've seen it in this conference, this emergence of data from our physical world. And we see it in growth in both, really, complexity and size. Complexity, right? The data comes from all kinds of vehicles. It comes from drones, from satellites, from IoT platforms, but then it also comes in all kinds of different forms, right? It could be imagery information, it could be point information, it could be point cloud information, so all kinds of information. So in terms of size, we are roughly adding 10 exabytes of information a day to this corpus of information about our physical world. So exabyte, that's 10 to the 18 zeros, so quite a lot of zeros. If you would print that on a piece of paper and you would stack it up, that is roughly 500 miles high. So I'm glad we're not printing it, because otherwise we wouldn't have an issue with wildfires, of course. Okay. Now, what can we do with all this information? Well, of course, you fight wildfires with water. But of course, all that information can help us to do this much smarter, right? It's not the solution at all, but it is definitely a key ingredient to this major problem, right? It allows us to prevent wildfires more effectively. It allows us to see them early on, to detect them. It allows us to track them. It allows us to forecast them. Now, why are we using all this information? And some are, you've seen this in this conference. But in reality, everyone talks about big data, but there are challenges to big data. And the first one is, and I already said that, the data we're dealing with is pretty big. And every utility who's dealing with all that information will run into some technical challenges. Now, when people say big data, what do they really mean by that? When I talk about big data, I typically mean the data is just too big to be moved. So one example is, for example, the European Space Agency. They produce, being used actually in wildfire monitoring quite a bit. They produce 20 terabytes a day. 20 terabytes a day, if you wanted to download this, it's going to take you a fraction of a week. Even if you've downloaded all that information, it's still going to take you at least 2 days to bring it from your disk all the way up to your processor to do any kind of processing. So the data is really big. The second point is the data is complex, right? It can be spatial, it could be spatial temporal, it could be a combination of both, it could be a point cloud, it could be imagery, all these kind of things. So it is fairly complex. It comes in different resolutions and different projections. Then, of course, wildfire predictions and wildfire monitoring is an ideal example. You always need a lot of other information. So you're really relying on the fact that you need a lot of layers of information. And then finally, if you look into traditional GIS systems, which would be used for this, they're really not quite ready for terabyte scale processing. All right, to address this issue, really to make the exploitation of all that information in the context of wildfires, in the context of vegetation management much easier, we invented a data platform which basically addresses some of these challenges. It first of all does all the data integration. So you can bring in data, we bring in data in real time from all the major weather agencies, from NOAA, from NASA, satellite information that is constantly being updated. It is basically a platform which curates all that information for you. We have commercial data in it, but you can also bring up your own data. So if you're an utility, you have GIS assets, you have GIS data on the assets, you can bring this into the platform. Now, once it's in the platform, you're getting away from the file-based systems people typically use to analyze that data. It is in a distributed system, which means it's on many, many, many computers. You can do parallel processing, the data is indexed, and it's highly scalable. So you can run calculations, use terabytes of that information in pretty much no time. So it's highly parallelized. Now, all data layers which are in there, whether this is weather data, whether these are fuel levels, whether this is elevation data, weather data, it's all linked in space and time. Now, the platform is accessible through different APIs and SDKs. These are basically ways to communicate with this platform. You can run data services. So let's say you're an utility and you're interested in all the satellite information 2 years ago and all the weather information. And by the way, you're also interested in elevation information for the same areas. It's just a simple API call. You can get that information. You don't have to do all the data curation yourself. The next one is you can run fairly complex queries. So let's say you're interested in, hey, where in my service territory the fire risk has increased by more than 2 points in the last 4 weeks. And is actually higher than last year. So you can run these fairly complex queries without downloading all that information it allows you. And then for people who are developing their own fire risk models, forecasting models, you can use platform services. Now, how do we use this for vegetation management and for wildfire? So we have all that information in the system. So we have satellite information, we have the European satellites, we have GOES, that is a geostationary satellite, which gives data every 5 minutes, very useful for tracking wildfires. And we have, of course, weather information. We have our own, IBM has their own weather information. You can bring in LiDAR, you can bring in the fuel levels, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of that information already curated, ready to go. It comes in all different shapes and sizes, but that's all being taken care of. Now, how do we use this for vegetation management? So what we do is we have a technology which allows us, with satellite information, to delineate trees. And from that delineation and from time series of multiple satellite shots, For example, these curves for NDVI, we can see which trees are greening earlier, or some trees, of course, don't green at all, or they green all the time, right? We can actually distinguish different clusters or species of trees. Now, from the delineation and from the tree type, we can then basically start estimating tree heights. Now, this is how it looks like, a typical result. You see your power lines in this image, and you see all these different colors, right? The different colors indicate different tree heights. Red means very low, so these are really not trees, there's some scrubs. And then eventually you can go up to very high trees. And you can use that technology to monitor every other week, really, how the vegetation is progressing as it may infringe on the power lines. Now, we're also leveraging LiDAR data. So LiDAR data is, of course, a beautiful way of getting a really detailed look on the vegetation. Now, from LiDAR data, one of the really cool things is you can get, with very high accuracy, the tree types if you have enough training data. So what we do is we use deep learning technologies, which is the same thing you would use for image recognitions of faces from photos, cats and dogs, and these kind of things, on this three-dimensional data, and then we can actually train that result on satellite information to then scale it out to much larger areas. All right, so now once we have the vegetation, and you can, of course, think about what you're going to do now in terms of wildfire predictions, right? So we have a lot of other information. We already talked about how we use vegetation management, the NDVI, the vegetation index. You can combine this with dead fuel levels, with energy release components, elevation data, soil data, etc. And that eventually gives you ways of accessing wildfire indices and you can obviously combine and plot these different layers as you see fit. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention.
Okay, now we're going to be moving on to the final panel of this track. It's titled Rethinking Utility Vegetation Management, Building Risk-Based and Performance-Driven Programs, which will be moderated by Jack McCabe.
Good afternoon. Thanks and welcome to the panel discussion on rethinking utility vegetation management. As was said, my name is Jack McCabe, and I'd like to start by thanking Liza and Dan with the California Public Utilities Commission for inviting us to be here and putting the summit together as a whole. Our objective here is to consider how we can apply the latest knowledge in fire science, risk management, forest monitoring, and analytics to build better performing programs. We're going to try to answer the question, how do we move forward with the right mix of detection, inspection, and mitigation to maximize the safety and reliability of the electrical system with regard to trees and vegetation? We have 4 experts today. They're going to start out by presenting their topic for 5 to 7 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for discussion and questions. So let me introduce the experts. We've got Mike Wilson, utility wildfire mitigation expert with CAL FIRE, John Goodfellow, a leading researcher and principal consultant with Biocompliance, Tom Martin, managing director of product, energy, and utilities for TROVE Predictive Analysis, TROVE Predictive Data Science, and Dr. David Marvin, CEO of Salo Science. With that, we're going to begin with Mike with CAL FIRE, so take it away.
All right. Good afternoon, you guys. Thanks for sticking through this second day in the afternoon, and for another important subject. It feels like this has been about a 5-day conference with all the information we've gotten, and I also want to really thank CPUC for spearheading this and making it happen. So I've been in CAL FIRE, started in 1987, right out of high school. So a few things I'm not: as a forester, arborist, a technology wizard, but my heart has been in it for the last 32 years. Quick little story. I've been wondering why I came back out of retirement. I tried to retire for a year, and came back to do this utility mitigation position. In 1992, I was on our helicopter crew in Lake County. Went to a run-of-the-mill grass fire in northern Lake County. A safety protocol we do is when there's power lines down, everybody going to the fire gets notified by the command center. Everybody checks in, positive acknowledgement. We circled the fire, saw the line down, landed and went up, did our thing, put out some, the area up ahead of the fire. Wasn't much, it was probably less than 5 acres. It happened to energize an old fence line that was under the duff, and nobody would have known. But the firefighter, probably 4 feet ahead of me, was standing right on the line. I could feel it, but she was able to, that was the end of her career that day. That plus many other fires that were utilities involved, and seeing my counterparts, you just been, like the chief said yesterday, we've had fires of biblical proportions for too many years now, and so that is what gives me the drive to work on utility ignition mitigation. For quite a few of the last 10 years, I've done vegetation management in the Sonoma Lake Napa area. And so, setting up community fuel breaks, utilizing our inmate crews, but never, obviously never directly with, in the utility right-of-ways. But I'm very familiar with vegetation management. I was able to help with some of the early rulemaking after the 2007 siege in San Diego that led to the beginnings of the fire threat map with CPUC, the ignitions that the utilities turn in each year. And now, in my current position, I'm helping CPUC to review the wildfire mitigation plans. And it's neat to see how the utilities are using their ignitions to really study in depth those causes and get some better answers for the future. A couple of things we're doing is in CAL FIRE is, along with utility mitigation plans, we're updating the power line fire prevention field guide, and we're going to get out and do more inspections. One of the things I'll leave you with here in this intro is a concept that I hope to add to the mix, and that is Public Resource Code 4291 is the defensible space around structures code. Used to require 30 feet up until the 2003 fire siege, and then went to 100 feet. And the original intent in the 70s and 80s was to keep structure fires out of the wildland. Just like when we do 4292, 10-foot radius around subject poles, that's to keep sparks from the pole from going into the wildland. When we went to 100 feet of defensible space, the intent also added to that, obviously protecting the structure from wildland, which we all think of defensible space as now. I think we should try to change or add to the intent the same outlook for defensible space for infrastructure, whether it be cell towers or electrical utilities. Therefore, in a lot of the wildfire mitigation plans, some of the companies are talking about doing pole clearing on even non-subject poles in the higher fire threat area, and I like to see that. So that's something that just in general we should add to the mix here for this talk. Thank you.
Cue some slides here. What I'd like to talk to you about is a question that I haven't seen addressed, and that is, how does a tree conductor contact potentially serve as a competent source of ignition of a wildfire? And so I just want to walk you through just a little bit of what we know about tree wire contacts and how they create risk. So the first thing we have to think about is the importance of the voltage gradient. And so the voltage gradient between two areas of unequal potential could be the nominal voltage between two phases, or it could be a phase to a neutral, or it could be phase to a grounded object, for example, across a transformer bushing, or it might be from an energized phase to earth. Each one of those is quite different. I like to break down these interactions into three categories: incidental contact, introduced contact, and strikes when the wire comes down. Each of those represents very different risk exposures. We know from the research that incidental contact caused by ingrowth of non-woody tissue into contact generally is not a source of ignition. It doesn't cause interruptions. It's extremely high impedance, and what you end up with is resistance heating and wilting of foliage. Unfortunately, the industry refers to those as burners, but it isn't actually burning. Of a greater concern are introduced contacts. They would occur in two ways. They may be a branch or a portion of a tree introduced into contact, or it may be the conductor deflects. Conductor sag is perhaps more an issue on a transmission circuit with long spans, but it could occur on a distribution circuit. But in either case, you end up with a branch or a portion of a tree bridging the gap between two areas of unequal potential. The voltage gradients that I mentioned in the fault pathways are important to consider, and each one of those kinds of pathways in an introduced contact can result in a different outcome. The wire down, the tear down scenario is a mechanical damage. It's certainly an electrical consequence to it, but they're very different than the first two kinds of failures. I'm using the word failure to describe a fault or an unintended flow of electricity. On the far right there, you can see we actually know quite a bit about the electrical characteristics of trees. Let me go forward here. Well, let me just first say, I don't know how well you can see the numbers there, but from Earth to an elevation of maybe 12 meters, somewhere 35 feet up, in a tree that's, or the conductor is contacting a small limb, we might have a impedance across the entire fault pathway of hundreds of thousands of ohms. If actually I've tested brand new growth, 1 meter of new growth from that small twig out to the tip, you might have 500,000 to 1 million ohms. Each one of those makes a difference to how the fault develops and whether or not there might be a competent source of ignition. So I mentioned gradient a couple times. It really has to do with the distance between and the voltage differential. Another thing that affects the likelihood of ignition is the available fault current, and that has a direct bearing really also on the overcurrent protection system. Now I have to say that I'm extremely optimistic today, and I wasn't so optimistic 2 days ago before this conference began, because we know about these electrical faults. But the signal disturbance that they create has been problematic. It's been very difficult to differentiate from background noise in the system. You heard perhaps this morning Dr. Russell talk about the work that he's done through EPRI at Texas A&M, and there's some great work going on in other places, looking at how you might detect these high impedance contacts that are due to vegetation contact in the conductor. And with the horsepower, if you will, of these big data processing capabilities, I'm very optimistic. There will be a day when we can get to determining, yes, it's a tree contact, and this tree contact has the potential to serve as a point of ignition. A couple different things happen related. So I just talked about the risk as it relates to the infrastructure. What effects do the fault pathway, provided the tree play in this. So we know that the diameter is really important, and we also know the length of the pathway is really important. Bigger diameters are more conductive, small diameters aren't. And the longer the pathway, the impedance or resistance, if you will, is additive. So short pathways and large diameters are at much greater risk. We also know that the condition of the branch is important, both live and dead. I've only got like 7 minutes to tell you a lot more about it. There's more we could say about that, but the 3 images you need to see. On the upper right, that is a test I ran where we actually were going to go to a runaway condition. The overcurrent protection would have seen that opened and interrupted the fault. The one on the lower left is much more common on the small diameter contacts anyway. Initially current flows and then current falls off as the track warms but does not carbonize, and that's the difference. You end up with a carbon track or no carbon track. No carbon track, you get heating, you get higher impedance, and the currents drop. The thing about the signature is, in fact, if you see the one on the lower left, how spiky it is, when these contacts are created, they're quite energetic, but they cycle. So first you have the track developing, then you have the heating, dropping the impedance, and things become quiet, and up and down and up and down. And that's what we hope can be detected by some of this sampling technology. And if I can go backwards. So that's Don Russell's work. I work with high voltages and really low currents. Don has a lab that he can have arcs at higher current events. And what I wanted to say in this particular picture is the branch serves as an initiator, but often the arc under high current situation will lift up off the branch and flow in ozone, basically. All right, going backwards, sorry. Okay, so what are the conditions that we need to start thinking about? Because really what I want to get to is, can we do better in doing condition assessment inspections? So I've broken this into 3 broad areas. There's a kind of an emerging area of science called tree biomechanics, and just threw some little sound bites out there for you. We know some things that I'm not sure that the engineers realize. Trees are not engineered structures. They're not easy to model. They're not easy to model, but we start to see some trends. So when you start thinking about clearances and why would you add more clearance, if you start thinking about how they fail, it starts to tell a little different story. And we also know that unlike people, when trees die, they don't fall over. There actually is a fair amount of literature out there on the fall down rates of trees. And so when you think about that, the previous speaker, earlier panel, was talking about real-time monitoring. Most of these trees that die in the drought will express symptoms beforehand and won't fall over for a couple of years. So I question the investment there. The other thing is to model tree growth. What I think he was unaware of is the phenological cycle. Trees do not grow year-round. Stem extension occurs over a relatively short period of time. So again, I would question the investment in real-time monitoring on clearance, perhaps. The other thing that I want to continue on that theme is if you think back to high school biology, there are 3 kingdoms: animals, plants, and fungi. Do not think of trees and tree performance in terms of your experience. They behave differently, and until we recognize that, we're not going to do what we should be doing in terms of smart identification of conditions that present elevated risk. But beyond the tree, trees are evolved to exist as in associations. So we need to think about the cover type and the forest stand and the integrity of the stand. And finally, I would say that the environment's really important. And here you see several of the presentations dealing with fire weather aspect, things like that. Another thing, back in the 1800s, the English Admiralty produced the Beaufort wind scale. And if you're a sailor, you're familiar with the Beaufort scale. It's really simple, but interestingly, it started to describe the wave patterns on water. It's been adapted to describe movement and dynamics in trees and plants. And so we basically started thinking about that. What can we learn from that? Well, first, a friend of mine at the University of Georgia stylized or made a surrogate tree and looked at the pressure exerted by wind, and you can see the ramp rate. It goes up several orders of magnitude. If we take the idea that these wind pressures are causing tree failures and we plot outages, I took the units off the y-axis on purpose because the shape of this curve is pretty much consistent with where I've seen things across North America. At some point, you get an inflection where the amount of tree failures go up. There's a steep, steep ramp rate. This particular graph is dealing with a mid-Atlantic utility with about 13,000 miles of line. The y-axis would extend up to about 350 events, outage events. My point is, at some point, the answer isn't more tree work. Now, Jack asked us, and I've got just 2 quick slides here. Jack asked us to talk about how do you really start to bring reliability thoughts to vegetation management. We're talking about maintenance programs, right? So there's 2 models that I've used. Both come from high consequence industries. Probability bow tie analysis was developed, I think, in Australia. It's used in refineries. Reliability center maintenance started with Boeing when it introduced the 747. Both of them, at their heart, have the idea that you do a failure mode and effect analysis, and you really start to understand how are the risks created and what do we do to mitigate or abate those risks. So there's a systematic way we should be approaching this. Finally, putting it all together, in my opinion, clearance is 1 step removed from reliability. If we open right-of-ways, if you think about the integrity of forest stands, it may well be that we are increasing the likelihood of failure of edge trees. If we do excessive side pruning on trees, we remove the dampers, and this mass damping effect is important. It explains tree failures during high load dynamic loads like wind. We can't get to 0. There will be residual risk, but I think it's a matter of public policy. How much risk is tolerable? We need to grapple with that. As I mentioned, trees aren't animals. There is real opportunity in this coming together of these different disciplines. I'm honored to say I am a full member of IEEE, but I'm also American Society of American Foresters and the International Society of Arboriculture. We think differently. And Mike, I bet you that the enforcers and first responders culturally think differently as well. If we can come together, I'm sure that we're going to come up with better solutions. And the final thought is, I've heard a lot about artificial intelligence, and the phrase that comes from science is that correlation doesn't mean causation. As I understand it, and I'm not an expert on AI, it's looking for correlations. And I'm here to tell you that we have natural intelligence. We understand more about trees than I think we realize, the collective we. And let's bring those 2 things together and up our game. Thank you.
We've heard a lot today, both on this panel and previous panels, about vegetation risk management, technologies for vegetation risk. I'm actually going to try and up-level the conversation a little bit to how do we use machine learning and artificial intelligence to think about risk as a whole. It's not just about managing the vegetation risk, but the risk to the electric system in its entirety. Any outage, whether it's vegetation or wind or a car pole or an animal, can drive that same wildfire risk. And I think in its simplest form, we can all agree reliability is good, more reliability is good, reducing risk is also good. In the ideal scenario, we would have perfect reliability with no risk on the system. The lights would always be on in the safest way possible. But at what cost? And I think the goal here will be to talk about how we move using artificial intelligence and machine learning away from these philosophical ideals into a real data-driven discussion. It should no longer be about reliability good, risk bad. That's not actionable. The way that you make this actionable is by thinking about the overall value creation. If you turn this from idealistic and an absolute into a formulaic-driven equation, you can now start to understand what is the value that is being created for the customer, for society as a whole, as users of the electric system. If we can invest money in increasing reliability, if we can invest money in decreasing risk on the system, and the value of that investment is worth more than the cost, then that's something that's worth investing the money in. If it's a situation where we start to hit diminishing returns on that investment, now we need to start thinking about that's the risk threshold that we're willing to accept. There's been a lot of really interesting discussion today and yesterday around what we can do to get better, but if you're not thinking about it holistically in the context of what can we do better at a certain price that we're all willing to pay for the lights to be on, that becomes a very difficult conversation. We worked with, this is a utility that's about the same size as San Diego Gas and Electric, and using machine learning approach analyzed over 400 different outage-causing attributes and outage predicting attributes for every single circuit on their system. The goal was to look at everything from vegetation location, species type, when was the last inspection, conductor size, distance between the poles, and 390 other attributes of the system, and build a predictive risk score that allowed us to understand where the risk was and what was driving it. Using this modeling approach, you get 3 different really important things. The first is a detailed understanding of where that risk is occurring, which feeders are highest risk, which segments of the circuit are at highest risk. 2, you then get a granular understanding of which of those attributes is specifically causing that risk. There's been a lot of conversation over the past couple days about the risk that's in a high wildfire area. That just because it's a high risk area doesn't necessarily mean that your investment into that area is going to bring a high return, a decrease of risk. You may simply be in an area that by its nature is high risk, and there's not as much investment that can actually deliver return in a particular area, given a particular setting. So by having the first, where is that? Second, what are the attributes? And then third, by combining the what and the where, you can get a line item by line item understanding of not only the mapping of the current risk, but what changes can be made to those 400 different attributes that will impact the future risk. I can look at line hardening. I can look at additional vegetation management. I can look at undergrounding. I can even take something like proactive de-energization that today is primarily used as a responsive measure. It's primarily used to react to a bad weather event, and I can actually build that into my intentional plan in an area where other safety investments are not actually going to deliver high value of risk reduction. I can build into my plan a certain percentage or a certain approach for proactive de-energization. In the same way that an investment banker can take your retirement portfolio and optimize the maximum return given a certain risk threshold, you can do the same on your grid management. If you have $100 million to do grid safety modernization, you can sit down, run through the model, and understand where and what measures are going to deliver the most reduction of risk given a certain portfolio, given a certain risk tolerance and funding availability. That then brings us to kind of what does it mean to be data-driven about your decision-making process? And by using AI and machine learning to analyze how we think about risk, we do two really important things. The first is you take the human bias out of these really difficult decisions. Right now, it's a human making a call on whether we do proactive de-energization. It's humans making a call on where we should put specific investment, and depending on the human in the seat, you're going to get different answers and you're going to get different recommendations. By taking the human bias out of the equation, we move from a really complex decision into a math formula, into something that can be tangibly understood. And then because it can be understood, we get a second awesome benefit, which is regulators, utilities, and customer advocates can all be on the same page. We can move away from the philosophical absolutes, reliability good, risk bad. At what cost now is the question that comes into play. Going back to that $100 million grid mod example, you can have utilities and regulators and customer advocates all sit down at the table and have a real, actionable, meaningful discussion. If $100 million gets me X% decrease in risk, and $10 billion gets me Y% decrease in risk, and looking at every snapshot in between, what is the appropriate or inappropriate risk tolerance for the community as a whole, and what should the community be expected to pay for that balance of wanting the lights on, but at a certain price that they're willing to pay? You move away from the theoreticals of, I want reliability, but I don't know at what cost, and you can now have all of those different stakeholders at the same table, understanding the value that you get out of a specific investment into making the grid safer and more reliable. So that's the goal for what we applied at some of these other utilities, is helping them understand and pinpoint the specific measures and the specific return on investment for each of those risk mitigation strategies. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Well, I'm a bit of an outlier on this panel. I am not in wildfire risk mapping or utility management. My background is in forest ecology and remote sensing science. And I'm here to provide a bit of a perspective farther out over a larger scale. I want to talk a bit about satellite remote sensing and how that can be used to assess risk, both in terms of threats to utility infrastructure, but also to understand if there is potential ignition points along these lines, what might happen afterwards, and how can you try to mitigate that risk ahead of time. See if this gets up there. Great, thanks. And so, as I mentioned, I'm a recovering academic. I spent the last few years working as a scientist for the Nature Conservancy. Prior to that, doing my postdoc at Carnegie Institution for Science at Stanford. And throughout that time, really saw the need to be bringing kind of this cutting edge technology and science from the academic realm out into the applied space. And so my co-founder and I, another recovering academic, co-founded this company, Salo Sciences. Been working on it the last couple of years and just launched it this past fall. Our main goal with this company is to try to increase the amount of technology and really cutting-edge science, bring it to the conservation world and the climate change mitigation world. And obviously, any kind of wildfire or restoration type of work intersects with both of those fields pretty well. I don't know if this is going to work or not. You guys getting that back there? Or?
Try it.
Well, anyway, I can talk generally about this. So with the conference the last day and a half or so, there's been a ton of discussion around using drones, UAV systems, and airborne systems to map at very, very high resolution, down to the centimeter scale. I want to talk a little bit more about the advantages that come with using satellites. And so, let's see, this thing keeps on running. Yeah, we're just going ahead, huh? Maybe it'll stop here. No, we're still going. So satellites traditionally have been these very massive, expensive projects. That's great right there. Thanks, guys. On the left side, going from the size of a school bus down to the right side, your right side there, to what we now have known as nanosatellites. Traditionally, it would take a decade to build and launch these sensors. On the left, they're very large ones, and they're still the workhorses of a lot of applications. But we now have these nanosatellite constellations that let us do things like map the entire Earth every single day. And so this is really important because most of the Earth is covered in clouds. And so if you're taking pictures of the same place on Earth every single day through a constellation of 150 different satellites, you can put that together and stitch together the best images over an area to give you high-resolution images over a forested area, over a residential area, whatever it is you're looking at. And you can get this cloud-free imagery. And because you have that daily snapshot, you can choose the time scale at which you want to be working on. So you can scale up and down whether you want daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly imagery over basically anywhere on the Earth. And so we built a system that can ingest data from these nanosatellite systems, ingest data from the traditional workhorse satellites like Landsat and Sentinel, and bring it in and take our understanding of forest ecology, of forest change, and be able to build new products that are usually take a number of years or extremely expensive equipment like airborne LiDAR to produce. And just briefly, there are obvious trade-offs. You get that very high resolution, sub-meter, even centimeter level understanding by flying rotary wing or fixed-wing aircraft or UAV systems. But honestly, the resolution you get off of these satellite systems isn't that much worse. So this is, and obviously from a higher up standpoint, how you would see drone versus satellite imagery. Drone, at about quarter-meter resolution, let's just say, versus 3-meter resolution satellite imagery, not much difference. If we zoom in, though, obviously, drone, you get that really crisp view. But if we look at the 3-meter resolution satellite image, it's obviously very coarse, but the main features in that image are still preserved. You can still see the trees, you can still see that small building there, the road is still visible, and so that imagery is still capturing the essential information in that image that you'd want to get. It's how do you extract that that's difficult. And that's where the advent of the cloud computing availability and deep learning, computer vision, artificial intelligence, these are all essentially the same thing, can extract that information out of these images that you might not think is there. And so we can take this image, we can run it through a deep neural network, and be able to actually map every single tree in that image at pretty high resolution, 3-meter resolution there. And this is just one example. This is just tree cover. But obviously, just mapping where trees are isn't all that informative. You want to start getting other aspects of forest structure, of forest change and dynamics over time out of this imagery. And so what I'm showing you here is an even larger scale now, looking at the western Lake Tahoe region. And this is all the airborne LiDAR that's available. I'm showing tree height, brown being lower height and up to green, and then orange and taller trees. This is that really precise, high-resolution airborne LiDAR mapped trees. We can take this imagery that's sparse and expensive, use it to train these deep learning models, and produce continuous coverage over the entire area of forest height using satellite imagery. And so it's a completely different way to think about how to map this. Instead of mapping in small areas with expensive equipment, we can do it over the entire areas of California. This is just the Sierra Nevada region mapped here. Every square meter is mapped for tree height. And obviously trees aren't growing, every week a meter or so. But over time, over say every quarter, over annual timescales, you can see how this height changes. You can see more obvious reduction in height where tree falls occur or where forest thinning projects are occurring. And so we can begin layering on, the forest cover, forest height. We're starting to map forest densities, the number of stems per, let's say, 10 square meters or so. We're beginning to see cutting-edge science coming out that can map the content of moisture in vegetation, so we can actually measure the amount of water contained in these tree canopies. We start layering this all together, and this provides really interesting information to understand priorities where we can start reducing fuel loads in nearby communities, nearby infrastructure for utilities, and begin hopefully reducing the potential for large-scale megafires to break out and really cause massive damage, both to property as well as to human life and safety. And so just to kind of bring it back to the utility thing, the approach here, we can map these. This is the transmission lines in Sonoma County. Sonoma County, for those of you who aren't from California or familiar, is where the Santa Rosa fires broke out in 2017. We can apply this information over the entire county, understand how tall the trees are and how far they are from transmission and distribution lines. We can map the tree cover in these areas. And we can do this just prior to the fire season or to the season you're going to go out and do thinning projects. And so being able to have this real-time information available without having to contract for airborne LiDAR or drone flights over large areas, we can do that pretty much instantaneously at this point. And so I just want to leave you all with this image here, and happy to take questions.
Thank you. So with that, we've got a little more than 20 minutes for open discussion and questions for the panel. We've got two people with mics, so go ahead and start in the middle.
Thank you. Great presentation. A question for John and maybe for David as well. As you know, the controversy is swirling about forest density, tree density. CAL FIRE's released a list of areas that they feel need thinning. And we've got environmental groups that are pushing back that say, the density actually creates the moisture, and if you start thinning them too much, then you are going to create more below canopy drying that could actually encourage the fires. So I'd like to get your read on what a level of moisture content you feel that is included with a denser grove of trees or denser forest, and how that might be approached by fire prevention or first responders. I think people really, this is a big controversial item, and people would really like to have some resolution on, do we thin the trees or do we keep the canopies and the densities together?
It's a really complicated question, and you really have to think in terms of forest structure and forest stand integrity. And so some of the things that would need to be considered are height and diameter and slenderness, because I'm thinking about not just the moisture equation, but the propensity of the trees to fail and strike lines. Another thing that comes to mind is this, there's a maybe an unintended consequence of this, in that you may bring enough light in to get the understory going and get laddering fuels that allow it to become a crown fire. I'm not an expert in combustibility of plant materials, but I know that any plant that's alive has a moisture content above fiber saturation point. And so I don't know how much variability of living green material, how much variability in combustibility there is. Maybe Mike, you know that even.
I don't know the science of it, but I can tell you that I've been involved with many times doing fuel breaks around communities that are shaded fuel breaks, where we do try to keep the canopy intact to reduce that undergrowth, and that is to keep those ladder fuels thinned out. And the more we can keep the canopy intact, the less undergrowth there'll be, and the less ladder fuels to climb up into the canopy to crown out. But then again, you're talking taking most stems that are 6 inches or less out, so therefore you are leaving the taller trees that could be in the strike zone of utility lines.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, so the idea with doing ecological thinning or restoration of forests is you're decreasing the density of these trees, but you're not removing all of the trees, and so you have just a completely open, exposed, ground surface. You're going to leave taller trees that have larger canopies. They have branches that aren't quite as low down as these much smaller trees, and so you may see increased drying on the forest floor of the material, but if that does catch fire, it's going to burn through at low intensity and eventually burn itself out. If you have that intense, very dense areas of trees that are all very small, low branches, that's where you actually can catch and begin to ladder up into the canopy and become a much larger fire. So I'm not so worried about the drying out vegetation in response to thinning. You need to remove the overall fuel loads that are lower down in the canopy.
Thank you. This question, I guess, is directed to Tom. You were talking about the use of data to take the human decision-making bias out of prioritizing, I guess, what improvements to make. But certainly, just broadly speaking, there's a lot of concern that algorithms don't really eliminate bias. They just embed bias as based on the perceptions of the people who create the algorithm. So if you're saying you can turn decision-making or turn prioritization at least over